So welcome everybody. This is the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics second conversation on Zoom. So this new Zoom technology is all new for the centre. And today we're having, these are conversations. So today's conversation is about geopoetics in Appalachia in North America. And we're going to be in conversation with Laura Hope-Gill and John Lane. So first of all, we're going to hear first of all from Laura, and then we'll hear from John. So I'll let each of you say what you'd like to say to us, and I'll just hand it straight over to you now, Laura, if that's all right.
Yes, that's lovely. Hello, everybody. A happy evening in Scotland. Good afternoon in Eastern United States. And I'm delighted to be here. It's such a beautiful story how I came to find the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics. I was working in a project with some economists, ecologists, climate scientists, and social entrepreneurs to design a hub for social enterprise here in Asheville in Western North Carolina. And I was the poet in the group, but somehow I was the convener and I was the communicator. And I was able to get these groups that were from very different silos to reshape their sentences and their paragraphs so they could understand each other, but their language sectors were so isolated that they needed a poet present to keep the conversation going. And I was at the South Carolina Aquarium one afternoon with my then about 8-year-old and now 18. And I thought of the term geopoetics for what I was doing. I was like, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing geopoetics. What a great term. It can't possibly be mine. And so I Googled it, and that's how I found Nori and you all. And I immediately sent a message, and that's how I connected. And it has been life-changing and life-expanding. And that's one thread. Another is here in the States, my two primary activities are a local poetry festival called Asheville Wordfest, and my other work is working with doctors and surgeons in infusing writing into their medical practice. And Asheville Wordfest started in 2008. In 2007, I attended the Associated Writing Programs Conference in Chicago that year. And that's where about 10,000 writers gather in a hotel, and it's very awkward for all of us. And I saw the big poster for this main stage reading that was supposed to be the core event. And it was 7 white writers and 1 Black writer. And it was an epiphany moment for me. It was, this has to stop. This cannot be how we create public literary events. And shortly after, I met Galway Cannell, and I visited him and his wife at their home in Vermont. And he mentioned that he attended a funny little school in the mountains back in the 50s. And I said, oh, what's your funny little school? And he said, oh, it was Black Mountain College. And no one, he had been admitted at the last minute, so he wasn't on the books as somebody who had attended Black Mountain College. And so with that, shortly on the heels of the AWP conference, I felt I got my message. And I feel that those of us who bound ourselves to the creative energies, the creative spirits early on, we wait for our messages. And I said, okay, I get it. My job is to create a festival that is culturally diverse and also one that grounds story in the mountains of Western North Carolina, so we know what our stories are. And so I gathered the poets in my home, and we had a great big pad of paper and a great big magic marker, and we wrote down, what should it be? How do you create a festival that's going to shift the stagnation, the cultural stagnation of a city that is cursed by Jim Crow legislation, and also that is cursed by the color line. Even though Jim Crow legislation is over, the city is deeply wounded. And this was, it was re-wounded in the 70s when the Black community was demolished. About 2,000 homes were torn down to create spaces for municipal buildings and a big wide road so rich doctors could get from the north end of town to the hospitals. And those people who lived in those homes, those communities that had known each other for generations and that had built the city, they were moved into 6 different projects. And that the term for what happened comes from a wonderful sociologist, Mindy Fullilove, and the term is root shock. And it's a gardening term for when you move a plant suddenly and you plant it somewhere else without giving it a chance to adjust to the change in sunlight. And our city is suffering from root shock. And that also led to this blocking of creative energy from the Black community. And this was stifling the youth and stifling relationships. And so with WordFest, my goal has been over the course of the last 13 years to, by creating a festival that has Black, Asian, multiple Native American nations represented at the microphone, to bring everyone together and blur these, get rid of that color line. And of course, we have an incredible color line between Cherokee and settlers, the European settler population in greater Asheville. And people didn't quite get it for the first few years. They were like, yay, we heard these famous poets, but they weren't seeing what my strategy was. And then Trump got elected. And it was just that year that my father died, and then Trump got elected. It was a really bad year. And, but I didn't do WordFest the year that my father died. And after Trump got elected, people started saying, we need WordFest. We really, really need WordFest. And they suddenly understood that multiculturalism cannot be taken for granted. And they didn't realize that there was a faction of American politics that wants to get rid of multiculturalism. And so that WordFest, I had no money, I had no venue, but I just put on Facebook, who has a venue and who wants to read? And we had a 6-day WordFest, 5 poets a night, events and workshops all day long at different venues around town. And it was, that was the beginning, really, even though it was 7 years in. And so that was a really powerful moment. And so geopoetics in that is working with the geography of a place and the social geography. Here in a Jim Crow city, for many Black residents, walking in 2 blocks over from this one area is fraught with traumatic memory of being spat at being beaten if you crossed what we call Broadway or Merriman Avenue. There were just parts of town that Black people, young people's grandparents and great-grandparents were not allowed to go. So you can't just say, here, we're going to open our doors and have this festival, we want everybody to come. You have to create something that is going to heal the genetic and geographical memory of a place. And poetry is beautiful for doing that, because there are poets in all pockets. So I had to find the poets who were writing in the Black community that people didn't know about and bring them to a venue, or bring white poets into the Black community. And this is how we get people to migrate and cross these lines of genetic memory. And so that was the science behind WordFest. And I drew on Buckminster Fuller and the design of the festival, 3s and 4s, 4 readings. I was drawing on all sorts of his design terminology, tensegrity. It was a really beautiful project to design, and then it became quite natural. And then it got cut off by the pandemic. And then my other work is with doctors and surgeons. And again, as somebody who has bound herself to the creative spirit, the creative energy. As a child, I was supposed to be a doctor. It was my family bloodline, my father, my grandfather, and going back beyond that. and poetry called me harder. And then I learned about narrative medicine in 2013, got trained at Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons, and asked the president of the university, can I have money to start a new program where I train doctors how to listen and how to write? And that has just really taken off. And I get more inquiries for that than I get for the MFA program that I run. And last night we had, on Tuesday night, we had guests from the Wellbeing Champions of North Carolina Physicians and Surgeons, and they're going to book me and my students to do monthly workshops. And a doctor from the Mayo Clinic joined us, and he will be working with me in the future, and we'll do work with them. Especially now with the pandemic, nobody will ever argue with me again that poetry and writing have nothing to do with medicine, because these are the things that have gotten us through the pandemic, and that doctors are turning to refuel what we call moral injury, in which it's more fierce than burnout. It's a term from the military, wherein human beings have been made to do inhuman things as part of an institution. And so this is what I heal. So those are my two geopoetic fields. And now I'll hand it over to my wonderful friend, John Lane. Hi, John.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Laura. That was great. I love hearing this story every time. I love to hear you tell the story. And thanks to Tina and Nori and Bill and everybody over there associated with the Geopoetics Center. So I was one of those poets that Laura brought in to speak at Wordfest a couple of times. And we've been friends since the 80s or 90s, I guess. And through Asheville, if those of you who know it, it's sort of a vortex. It's a nexus. It's people flowing in and out. Some people say there's a big ley line, set of ley lines across there, and the energy bubbles up. And you can feel it when you go there. I'm from about 30 minutes east of there and a little bit south. I'm in the Piedmont. On the East Coast, you've got the coastal plain where I am now. This is not a fake background. I'm in an actual beach house. And you've got the coastal plain, which goes on for about 80 or 90 miles. And then you've got the Piedmont, which is a hilly region underlain with crystalline hard rock. And then you've got a 2,000-foot jump to the Appalachian Mountains. And it's a mountain front that we actually call the Blue Wall. And that's where Laura is, and I'm down the mountain. I sometimes joke that there should be a checkpoint for passports between where I live and where she lives. The worlds are so different. It could almost be two different countries. So I came to Wordfest, I think my second time in 2018. And I had been teaching for many, many years in an English department as a literature and a professor and a literature, a writer, a poet. And then about 2010, I created my own department, and I pulled away from the English department. This is in a small liberal arts college in Spartanburg. And I created my own department, and we created an environmental studies department. And then I became the director of a field station nearby on a creek called the Goodall Center for Environmental Studies. And environmental studies programs are very popular in the United States. They are programs that often have 2 or 3 branches teaching in the same program. They're interdisciplinary. There are scientists, field scientists. There are social scientists who study policy. And then in the best programs, I like to think, there are also humanists. But they're not always humanists. Humanists are the one program that get the short shrift, usually. Like in really high-powered programs, several of them, there are no humanists, there are no poets, they're just social scientists and scientists. But at Wofford, when I created this program, I made sure that all 3, the science, the social science, and the arts and humanities were on the same tabletop, and they all had the same and equal space and the same funding and all that. And so this environmental studies center that I ran for 10 years, I'm retired now. I retired last spring, thank goodness, before Zoom hit. But when we created this program, we made sure that those three disciplines are always, we call them the three legs of the stool, and they're always engaged in anything we do. So by the time I got up to Wordfest in 2018, I had already been involved for many, many years with the outlets in the United States for this sort of work. One in particular was an organization that I became very, very involved in. That's been going for about 25 years now, a big organization called the Association for Study of Literature and the Environment. And that organization, there's now a UK branch of it. There has been for a decade or so. But that organization brings together writers and scholars to talk about literature and the environment. So being a poet, I came out of what years ago you could, without derision, call nature poetry. And then nature poetry sort of morphed into eco poetry or green poetry, or now people are calling it environmental poetry, or some people even going as far as calling it climate poetry, putting climate at the center of this. I know climate fiction has become a huge thing. I haven't seen climate poetry talked about quite as much, but I've always been interested in these sort of this nomenclature and people sort of putting things into these groupings, academics putting things in these groupings. Even though I'm not a PhD trained academic, I like to joke and go, I have an MFA in poetry. But I've always been fascinated by it. And so I was already aware of the term geopoetry by the time I arrived at Wordfest in 2018. And I loved the term. And it's really interesting, something Laura said, I automatically went to the word geology from geopoetry rather than geography. And the reason I did that is because around 2005, I became smitten with a Canadian poet named Don Mckay. And Don Mckay is truly a geopoet. Don Mckay has written many, many, many poems in which he explores geology and the landscape and people's interactions with geology. And he wrote an essay about 2005 called Geopoetry, in which he talked about how he discovered a geologist named Harry Hess, who in 1957 published a paper called an essay in geopoetry. And what he did in this essay was talked about his research, which was the early research on seafloor spreading with continental collision and all that. And he had gone so far and had so many ideas about it that he felt like he'd outrun the science. And so he said in that essay that he had to resort to geopoetry. He had to resort to geopoetry in order to communicate where he was going with this actual science. So in 2005, and that was Harry Hess, H-E-S-S. He was at Princeton, I think. And in 2005, Don Mckay discovered Hess's essay, an essay in geopoetry. And Don Mckay wrote his own essay. And here's my favorite paragraph from that essay. I'm going to read this. If I can get my iPad to turn on. There we go. Here's what Don Mckay said. Geopoetry. Geopoetry makes it legitimate for the natural historian or scientist to speculate and gawk. And equally legitimate for the poet to benefit from close observation and from some of the amazing facts that science turns up. It provides a crossing point, a bridge over the infamous gulf separating scientific from poetic frames of mind. Everybody knows probably that he's referring there to the old battle between science and the humanities that goes back to the 1960s and even earlier. So a gulf which has not served us well, nor the planet we inhabit with so little reverence and grace. Geopoetry, I'm tempted to say, is the place where materialism and mysticism, those ancient enemies, finally come together have a conversation in which one hearkens to the other, and then they go out for a drink. So those places where materialism and mysticism meet, those crossing points. So this is what I came to Wordfest with in 2018. And then I met Nori, and Laura was already doing this, and there was a whole program on geopoetry, and I was introduced to Kenneth White through this program. And I realized that Kenneth White had been on the same journey. I've never seen an essay in which anybody pinpoints the exact moment Kenneth White used the term geopoetry the first time, although it's been done, I'm sure. But anyway, you had those two parallel tracks. You had White's track, and then you had this track in Canada with Don Mckay talking about geopoetry. And then here I was. The book that I was representing at that conference was a book I just published called Anthropocene Blues, in which a geologist is the main character, and he argues with the term Anthropocene and the shift from the Holocene to the Anthropocene in geology. I had a lot of fun with that book. So I'm up there, I meet them, and I go into this deep dive with geopoetry. And then here we are, 5 years later, Laura? Since that time, we're still talking about geopoetry, and now Laura has begun a conversation and about it becoming a thing in the mountains, and we're hoping that's where this goes. That we're going to get some good ideas out of that, and know what to do, how to move forward with it. So that's my little spiel, and then I'm going to turn it back over to y'all. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'd like to add that there's one little missing link that I neglected to mention. And John, your story is fantastic. And I see this as you and me, by the way. In 2017, I attended Expressing the Earth on Seal and the Geopoetics conference, and met many of you there. And that was where Alastair McIntosh needed a place to pitch a tent in a yard. And I had rented the last cottage on the Isle and gave him a room. And then for the next Wordfest 2018, I flew Nori, Alastair, and Birgit over and housed them in a little cottage that we couldn't find because the ferries interrupted our journey, but we got there eventually. And so that was how we launched Geopoetics. On the final, we had, Nori gave a beautiful reading from what is now Barnhill, and also a talk on Geopoetics and Thomas Wolfe. And Alastair gave 2 talks as well. And it was the best Wordfest we ever had. And on the final day, it was this rainy spring morning, about 50 people show up at 9 o'clock in the morning for a Geopoetics Appalachia launch. So that was the big moment. So I'm going to mute because the dogs aren't muting. Oh, there they go. Okay. So we'll be quiet, and you can ask questions, and let's generate the conversation.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much, both Laura and John. That was really inspiring and exciting. Great to hear, great stories. So I'm going to open it up now to questions. Would anybody like to answer a question in person? If you either just put your hand up or use the hand up, the hand, or even type in the chat if there's anything that you'd like to ask. Or even just any comments. Now, let me see. Here, sorry, I'm not seeing, it's Lex Braze 1.
Hi, Tina. I've got a question about, can I ask a question about Black Mountain status? Is Black Mountain still in functioning?
Wonderful question. No, the college itself is not functioning in either location, and the second location is now a camp for boys in the summer, and you have to get permission to walk on the property. But the frescoes by a couple of the artists there are still there under the student studies building that the students designed. And you can call and say, I'd like to take a Black Mountain tour. And you can, we walked there with Nori and Alastair and some other people when we went. There is a Black Mountain College museum, and they are doing excellent work, archiving and presenting talks. And I was a part of a presentation of the women who attended the Black Mountain College, where we performed songs that were composed at Black Mountain and presented the artworks and wrote poems to the artworks by the women. And so we do projects like that. There's also a Black Mountain Review that is inspired by the principles of Black Mountain College, but it's based somewhere in the Southwest, I think. But they are, John, do you know if the Black Mountain Review,
No, I don't. I didn't know they'd revived it. That's great.
It's based on the principles. And so there we go. Yeah, we're piecing it together bit by bit. And
thank you.
If anybody wants,
we've got a question. Sorry, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say, if anybody's really interested and wants to take a dive into Black Mountain, you should read Martin Duberman's book, Black Mountain, An Experiment in Community. Big, thick doorstop of a book.
Okay, maybe you could type that into the chat later on when you're not being asked questions.
I'm using my little iPhone, so it's hard to do anything.
Exactly. There's a question here for you, John, from Alastair Duncan. And he says he was intrigued by Hess. Was it Harry Hess?
Harry Hess.
And the two streams of geopoetics. And he was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more to contrast them.
Yeah, well, I can tell you a little bit more about Hess. He was a Princeton geologist. His work was some of the original work in seafloor spreading, and that led to the breakthrough, the paradigm shift about what we now call continental collision in the 1960s. By about 1968, the paradigm or 70, the paradigm had finally shifted, and everybody realized that there were these chunks of continent that floated around on this molten rock, and they slammed together about every 60 million years, and then they floated apart. And he's the one who did a lot of that early research. And because they didn't have a lot of they didn't have any digital technology back then, a lot of the work he was doing was based on small amounts of data. And so his early papers, he felt he was right, but he couldn't quite prove it yet. So that's why he seized on this term geopoetry and geopoetics, because he thought he was out beyond his data, but he knew he was right, and he was using language more like a poet uses, he felt. And finally, by 1987, he published all of his papers that had. I'm getting low on my battery here. I don't know what I'm going to do. We had published all these papers that would become his scientific work in geopoetry.
And are they available to us?
I found a couple of them PDFs online. I don't have anything with me here. I'm running here and get my phone. But yeah, they can be Googled. Okay,
we can search for them. Okay, are there any other questions? Anybody else? Oh, wait a minute, here's one. So we've got a question from Loriana. Sorry. Do you want to ask it? No, Lori.
Yeah, I can ask it. Maybe it's completely inaccurate, but would you think lockdown pandemic poetry could go under geopoetry? Is there a connection in your opinion?
Beautiful, lovely to see you, Loriana. Hi.
Yeah, lovely.
Oh, good. I do. I view the geopoetics in a very broad strokes, that it's wherever we need a bridge, right? Wherever we need a bridge between poetry and creativity and finding meaning in mechanistic systems. And the pandemic is this remarkable example of an infusion of a mechanistic system with story. There, one writer, Dr. Rita Sharon, who's the founder of the narrative medicine program at Columbia, she says that illness and death have a way of drawing the veil, illness and grief have a way of drawing the veil back on life.
Yeah.
And I connect that to Buddhism with it. It just pulls back all the distractions. And what are you left sitting with? You're facing the emptiness. You're facing a void, a zero reference point. And so I think that we'll be writing about this for a long time. We saw how our communities are impacted by silence and neglect. Yes. And we saw how stories kept us alive. Like we all turned on Netflix and it was the writers, it was the stories, it was the films that sustained us as we moved through. And something I find very interesting, a friend of mine is a filmmaker, and I asked him and some of his producer buddies, what are the stories that we'll turn to, that we'll turn to Hollywood for when this is over? And the big Hollywood producers, there's thunder. Yeah, the doctor voice of thunder. So, and they said love stories and escapism. But if we look at the Oscar list for this term, they're deeper stories. There's stories of deafness. There's stories of a Palestinian film is up for an Oscar. We have Nomadland is up for an Oscar. We have stories of race that are up for Oscars. So the stories are not us turning away from reality, but turning deeper into it. And so the geopoetics there is, we're turning away from the mechanized into the meaning and even the mystical. John, I'll let you talk now. It seems that my dogs are quiet, but I hope you can.
Yeah, I would go back to
Thank you.
To White's definition. I saw this quoted in a blog, but White said, you start when writing poetry with local knowledge, with whatever is under your feet. And if that's going to be the definition of where we start with geopoetry, then of course, yes, there will be pandemic poetry that will come out of it, because what's been under our feet for more than probably in our lifetimes, all of us, is the local. And some of us have struggled with it, and other of us, like I've flourished. I mean, we travel a great deal, but we haven't traveled at all in the last year. And I have gotten to know my local, and I knew my local landscape very, 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 very well, but I know it even better now, because in the last year, I've walked more locally than I have in the last 10 years, because I could go elsewhere. And now I couldn't. Now how that's going to balance now going into the next year, I don't know. But I agree that starting with whatever's under your feet is a good starting place.
I completely relate to that. Sort of getting to know our local environment even better. There's a question here from Linda Golden. Would you like to ask it in person?
Okay. I was smiling with interest because it sparked my curiosity about your poetry taking transition from nature poetry towards eco poetry, climate poetry, geopoetics. And so my question was, should I think about the transition, learn more about the transition, or just keep writing and see where the writing goes?
In my case, the thinking was really important. I read widely. I knew these transitions were underway because I was part of this organization called the Organization for the Study of Literature and the Environment. But with my own poetry, I just discovered that, like a good example is I was obsessed with wilderness through my 20s and 30s, getting out into what I thought, designated wildernesses. In the US, we have these areas called designated wildernesses. And I love to be in areas that were designated and considered wilderness. I knew that they had been Native American places, that they had been in many ways, sometimes settler places, but that they had, quote, gone back to the wild. And I liked those places, and I like to be away from human-made places. And then about 15 or 20 years ago, I started just exploring my own landscape around my home more, and realized that I wasn't going to get out into what I would call wilderness very much, that all these were nearby places, and they were places that were impacted by human settlement or human industry. And I really enjoyed watching myself interact with these new landscapes and thinking about the pressures and the terrible consequences of our settlement and our development. You know, one of my prose books, I'm also a prose writer. I've written many books of essays and nonfiction. And one of my books was called Coyote Settles the South. And it was an exploration of what happened when a Western animal moved into the South and found it very hospitable. Coyotes are now in every single county of the South, and they've been very, very successful. That's a book I wouldn't have written when I was in my 20s, when I was thinking more about nature being something out there rather than something right around me. And so for me, it's been very instructional to look at those differences and to think about when these transitions happened.
That's wonderful. And we've got a question from Patrick Corbett.
Well, thanks, Tina. My video has stopped, but I think you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Yeah, no, because I'm on my mobile phone here. So, you know, I've just come in a little bit late to this meeting, and I was fascinated to hear John talking about Don Mckay's work and Harry Hess. Of course, Harry Hess is well known to geologists, you know, for plate tectonics, and I had not appreciated there was this connection to geopoetry. So, as people on the call might know, we are putting together a volume on geopoetry and geopoetics. And, you know, it seems to me, and we're trying to tease this out in the book, that there are two types. So it was very interesting that John always referred to geopoetry when people in the geopoetics always referred to geopoetics. And I think there are two different things here. But in the book, I don't think we try to separate these. I think there is a overlap and there is a link between the two. And I think the geopoetry has got a stronger link to geology. So that's, I think, I would concur with that. But I think it's fascinating. I shall go and do a bit more background reading and make sure we credit the people who started the geopoetry. If Harry Hess is the first person. And you know, we hope that this volume will help set out and inspire people to come into this world and to add to it over the years. So, and I think it is different a little bit from environmental poetry and nature poetry per se. So I think the appreciation of the earth and the rocks and what the rocks are speaking and telling us is something different from what nature is telling us. But I think it'd be much easier to discuss this in a beer over a meeting than it's talking to a blank phone in a room somewhere and no idea who's out there. So I'm going to stop speaking.
That's great. Well, we could hear you loud and clear anyway, so that's great, Patrick. And we've got a question from Richard Roberts. Would you like to ask your question, or would you?
Yes, please.
Yeah, great.
Yep. Could we go back, however, for a moment to Laura Hope-Gill's introduction and the description of an event at which Native Americans, white people, black people, and white people had all, as it were, possessed the land. You had the Native Americans, then you had the imposition of rational land ownership and invasion by colonials, and then the slavery imported, the descendants of the black slaves driven off their land, and the whites imposed. How do you see the ownership of land being resolved, because so many people, like myself, my ancestors, my father came from Central Europe, my connection with the land of Bohemia is broken. You know, I'm a migrant. So how does one resolve? What is it? What is the commonality that you were developing, which would hold people and not merely exacerbate conflict?
Yes, wonderful. Sorry, I wasn't muted on that question. Thank you. It's a heartbreaking situation, and it's not one that can possibly be set aside. There's a call out to America and the world and the royal family, if you will, to go back 400 years and start over, really, because every single system is infected with racism, colonialism, and oppression. And here we are, 2021. How do we begin? Right? How do we begin? Each of us, how do we begin? And how do we take on the responsibility without falling into despair? So my strategy with Wordfest has been to build trust. I wrote 2 architectural histories of Asheville and delved into the social history of the city. So every single ornamental bit of architecture that gets mentioned also gets mentioned with who were the servants in this house. And I found the servants, I found the grandchildren of the servants. And in writing about some of the buildings, I drew attention to who were the architects and the builders, and they were often liberated slaves. They were all liberated slaves, including our premier architect of our city. And so what happened with those conversations is many of them were very, uncomfortable. I had to build trust, and I had to gain entree into spaces where, oh, here comes another do-gooder white liberal chick who has written a grant and who is getting money for this book she's writing and is going to benefit off our story. I had to not do that. I had to not be that girl. And how do you not be that girl? How do you not be the virtue signaler? How do you not be the white hero? You do that by showing up. You do that by showing up at their parties. You buy tickets to their fundraisers. You buy plants from their farm sales. You show up, you show up, you show up, and you become a friend, and not just somebody who wants to record the history of this group. You just become a friend. And you befriend people on social media who don't look like you. And you share their posts. You make sure that for every white person's post you share 10 Black people's posts. And somebody, Dee Stribling, had asked about how I reached out to the Cherokee. And with that, I went to Cherokee and I sat in a coffee house and wrote poetry on my own. And then if somebody talked to me, I talked to them about poetry. And then we developed a poetry reading at a common. It's this question very well. And that became a monthly event where I would drive an hour and a half out to Cherokee, no matter what the weather was. I would show up and listen to the poems, not as the bridge builder, not as the girl with the grant. There was no grant, there was no funding, and I made friends. And one of those friends is now my co-director for Wordfest. I have a co-director, and she is Cherokee, Kara Forbes, and she's fantastic. And she's going to go into a graduate program in learning Cherokee. And so this is what you do. You bring it down to the heart level. You take it down from theory. You take it down from every essay you've ever written about the past and read about the past, and you make friends, and you learn how to be a friend. And it doesn't become a friendship between me and my Black friend. It becomes my friendship with somebody for whom I would lay down my life, and I will fight with them, for them, with them. And so we just have to keep it social, keep it really, really social, and de-intellectualize it. It's not a revolution, it's a friendship, and we're aiming for global friendship. And so what better way to do that than a festival, right? You know, let's get together and have teachers from all cultures and get rid of this idea that it's the white people that have the solution, because that no one does. How do you build from nothing? That's where we are. You build from nothing by holding someone's hand and saying, I'm going to be kind to you.
That's
wonderful reply. Thank you.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear that sensitivity and that awareness. And I think this is really what we need so much more of now. So we're going to go back just a little bit again to geology and geopoetics, and Andy Abraham would like to add something to that.
Am I speaking? I think I am. Yeah. Thank you. You know, it was interesting listening to John, talk about about Hess and about the continental drift. And I come here. I'm actually a geologist, and I look at it. I fell into, writing poetry, and creating art. But what I found was, and I even find more so now, is a lot of what's written, especially technical papers on geology, are incredibly difficult to read. And right now, geologists are going through a process where we're trying to learn how to communicate again with the public. And not blow them away with jargon, but to actually come down to an empathetic level where we understand what their needs are and how they feel, and to address that in a way that makes them comfortable with who we are as geoscientists. And it's interesting because geologists are finally recognizing, well, we actually have to talk like normal people. And become like that. It's fascinating to me because I see so many realms of it. And as Patrick said, and I look at it and say, when I first looked at geopoetics, I thought, oh, it's all about geology. And then I was lucky enough to be part of the geopoetry event in Scotland, although we were all online. And Norrie, I listened to his talk and was just, blown away by the connectivity and some of the artwork I've created. I just started realizing how I was connecting what I was seeing with human nature and human psyche. And I had no idea of that connection before. And now I see that there's so much more out there beyond what I'm seeing. And that's part of the world. I think now we're trying to connect more with people and more with dealing with the racial issues that have gone on for hundreds of years and how we can change the status quo. And so, I'm going to learn a lot. I'm starting here new, and I just look at it. I say it's wonderful to be connected with you all. Thank you.
That's really wonderful. It's wonderful to have you here with us all, and thanks for that. And I have to say personally, here I found fossils here, and I knew nothing about fossils or anything, and really started to want to learn and know more. And I delved into the geology, and honestly, it was like, I don't have time to learn this other language. I just want to know what this stuff is. So I really get what you're talking about with this dense science.
May I say something?
Yes, of course.
In response to Andy, I would like to, what comes to mind when you were talking about geology and when we're talking about the environment and we're talking about cultures and people, I think that one common thread is we're not going to be extractive anymore with whatever subject we're talking about, whatever project we're doing. We're not going to harm the earth, and we're not going to harm other people in what we do. And it's been extractive, right? It's like seeing people as resources, seeing the earth as resource, and taking. And so this is what you just stirred in my imagination, Andy, is that we're just And with stories and building community, the Black community in Asheville is always getting asked to do oral histories, and it's extractive, and people get their oral histories for their college degree and then they don't give back to the community. And so it's this habit of extracting. Here's something, here's some terra nullis. What can I take from it? And we're going to stop that. That's what comes to mind. Thank you for informing me on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I wanted to insert something here. I've been thinking about a lot. My next book is a nonfiction book is called Gullies of My People. And it explores my education in geology. Although I didn't major in it, I took 3 courses in college, and I had a mentor, a geologist mentor in college that changed my whole life, and really set me on the road as a poet. And I've been talking a lot with some geologists here locally about whether or not an understanding of deep time is something you can come to by way of data and knowledge, or whether it's something that you can only come through by sort of what a couple of my friends call a road to Damascus experience, that you're struck down with this idea, oh my God, the earth is this old. I mean, that you almost can't come to it by way of data. And I think that that's an important part of this geopoetry discussion, is that, you know, Hess embraced the language of poetry because he was out beyond his data, and he needed to find some way to catch his colleagues up to where he was. And he hoped that he could convince them by using this long enough to where he'd have the data to fill in the gaps. But I think we need to keep thinking about this idea of how we come to these concepts, these ideas that are very difficult for people to understand. I'm down at Edisto Beach in South Carolina, and I've been collecting fossils here for over 50 years now. And when I'm walking, they're all Pleistocene age fossils. There's a big bone bed offshore that's being uncovered, and stuff washes ashore every day. And the people who are down there competing, extracting from this beach, I've taken on what I call catch and release fossil hunting. Like, I find something and I throw it right down on the back on the beach. I don't carry it away with me. I give somebody else who doesn't have that joy, because I've found all this stuff over 50 years and organized it and stuff. But I keep thinking, how many of these folks walking this beach have any understanding about the Pleistocene and what a glyptodon is, if they find a glyptodon scoot? Or what's the difference between a mammoth and a mastodon, where you can find both teeth on the beach? And I keep going. I wonder if there's a poem I could write that would get them closer to this understanding than they are now, or whether it's something that only a few people can be struck down and understand. I don't know.
That's wonderful. I love it. Nori?
If I could just respond about deep time, I actually, part of my PhD was doing geochronology, and I always found myself and pulled myself back when I would make the claim that I had dated a particular rock to 2 million years, plus or minus 2 million years. And I would sometimes sit there and say, what the heck am I talking about? And then when I was actually trying to bracket the age of gold in this area, and I got it down to 30 million years. And I said to someone, you can open and close an ocean in that time.
Yeah.
And we consider it as normal when we talk. And for most people who aren't geologists, deep time is something that we have such a great difficulty understanding. And I agree with you, totally.
So write that poem that'll make it clear to us.
Both of you. Great. Nori, were you going to say something? Are you putting up 5 minutes, or what?
I want to take us on to something else. I think it's very significant that so many geologists have sort of tuned into geopoetics in recent months and years, especially as a result of the World Book Day, the 1st of October event that Pat Corbett organised last year. A lot of new members who are geologists have come into the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics. And I think there is a discussion to be had about the difference between geopoetry on the one hand and geopoetics, which is a much wider concept. It involves the creative expression of the earth in all the sciences and the arts. And I think White's work goes much beyond simply a poetic expression of the geology of the earth or elements of geosciences. But rather than continue, I think the book that Patrick referred to, which will come out either towards the end of this year or a wee bit later, will clarify some of those issues. I've done an essay on that, the difference between geopoetics and geopoetry. But the issue I want to bring forward to ask John and Laura is, how do you see the network of Geopoetics Appalachia developing in the future? Do you see it as a membership organisation the way we are in Scotland, where people pay £10 a year or £5 if they're unwaged? Or do you see it as a looser gathering of people who connect through Zoom or through actual events and meetings, that once it's safe to do so? And how could working with the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, which is, as John has said, a very big group, how could you develop work with them which would bring geopoetics to their attention and involve some of them in a study of and the practice of geopoetics?
Big question. John.
Oh, I was just going to say very quickly, I think that when this anthology comes out, the Geopoetry, Geopoetics anthology, it will go a long way toward that, pointing people in this direction. It will be easy to point to that and go, here's what we're talking about. Already, I've been talking with a dear friend of mine, a geologist at Duke University, named Dan Richter. He's a soil scientist, and he's fascinated with the idea of geopoetry and geopoetics. And he had a huge conference up at Duke last year where he brought up some of these issues. It was a conference on, oh gosh, my mind is slipping. Who's the 18th century wonderful scientist that White quotes all the time, that went all over the world?
Humboldt.
Yeah, Humboldt. He had a Humboldt conference, and for 3 days of papers about Humboldt, and it was fantastic. And he's interested, and he would be interested in any of this, and I think the ASLE people would as well. It may be that the next in-person ASLE, we should just put together a panel, and bring a couple of people over, and the people who are coming this way anyway. I don't know where the conference would be. The conference will be online this time in the summer. But after that, 2 years from then, it'll probably be back in person somewhere. So that might be a good start.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to let Laura speak to where we're headed.
Wonderful. The very nice thing is that John mentioned ley lines earlier, and in thinking about how things emerge and how things align, things have aligned really beautifully. Wordfest just got silenced by the pandemic twice in a row, and I look at that and I'm like, okay, universe, why are you doing, does this mean I'm off the hook for Wordfest going forward? John just retired, so has free time. I just changed my Master of Arts in Writing program into a full-blown MFA program, which took about 3 years. And so it feels that things are shifting into a new time. then this occurs, this emerges. Nori says, John and Laura, let's talk about Geopoetics Appalachia. What's it going to look like and what's it going to do? So it's time to manifest it. And I have a university. I have a beautiful location here in Asheville. I've been working with the city of Asheville and the Thomas Wolfe Society and Thomas Wolfe Memorial. We rescued a cabin where Thomas Wolfe wrote Party at Jack's when he did go home again, and was too famous to enjoy it. So he just got drunk in a little log cabin outside the city. And we've just rescued that little log cabin, and we're building 14 LEED certified state-of-the-art writers retreat cabins around it. And I think that would be the place, a beautiful place to host a Geopoetics Appalachia conference. There'll be a big meeting area on the property as well. But until that's finished, we have Lenoir-Rhyne University in Asheville where we've hosted Wordfest. So it's just a matter of choosing a date, sending the emails out, getting the people to come, and we don't even have, we can even do it in Zoom, John. And as a business model, Nori, we're just going to mirror you, okay? We're going to copy you completely because you work. You have a functional organization. So why fix what's broken, right? So yes, we will do memberships for people who can afford it, but definitely not absolutely require it. Wordfest has always been a sliding scale, and it has always broken even. Always. I never make $5. I never lose $5. And I never tell people what they have to pay. I leave it up to nature to do the math, and nature does a really good job. So we will, and also another beautiful property of the moment is that we've both built our networks. John has built a beautiful network, and Wordfest has a beautiful network. We have about 1,000 people on our Facebook group, and the community trusts us. We have earned their trust, and I also have, we've built our multicultural trust as well, and this is what it would have to be. It would have to be a multicultural organization with multicultural leadership in order to continue the friendship and compassion movement.
It all sounds very beautiful and very exciting. There's a question here, I think. Are you wanting to ask a question, Mark Sheridan? Have you got your hand up?
I do have my hand up.
Okay.
Thank you. Having once been a teacher, always a teacher. Thank you. Bear with me a minute. I'll wander slightly, but I really want to come back to John and Laura with a kind of question. I was struck by what John was saying about Hess. And what he seemed to be doing is what all of us as artists, no matter what we are, try to do, which is trying to explain the unexplainable. And in a sense, at that time, he didn't have the tools, I think, John, you were saying, in terms of data and so on. But in terms of, and Nori brought up Kenneth White, and I feel bound in some way to, in a sense, ground us. As a composer and as a composer, all my life I've been trying to make sense of what I'm doing and trying to analyse what I'm doing and trying to find a way. And I found this through Geopoetics, so we'll get to know Nori and Kenneth White and so on, a kind of grounding there, because often composers over the millennia have often not been really terribly sure of what they're doing, even at the time. Like Beethoven's a good example, Schoenberg, and it's only long after their work. But I want to quote some from Kenneth from 1989. Geopoetics provides not only a place that's proven more and more necessary where poetry, thought and science come together in a climate of reciprocal inspiration, a place where all kinds of specific disciplines can converge once they're ready to leave over-restricted frameworks and enter into a global, cosmological, cosmopoetic space. And it seems to me that where John and Laura are is in a sense of trying to, create or ground that space in a sense, have a sense of where it's at and define it. For us, I know with Nori and others in our group, we try to kind of go back to the kind of Kenneth White paradigm, if you like, almost as a guide. I'm offering these thoughts because it strikes me that it's part of that journey that you're on and drawing the same kinds of things together that we're drawing. I'd be interested in John and Laura's response, if indeed they make sense of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think that what I've been trying to do since 2018, and Nori can attest to this because I've blown up his email box since that time, asking questions about geopoetics and trying to understand how this particular sort of Venn diagram works, because I've got this whole area that I'm very interested in and have been for 25 years, eco poetry, green poetry, nature poetry, the Association to Study Literature and Environment, something I haven't brought up yet called long-term environmental reflection. All those things are sort of my stuff that I've explored deeply. And then in 2018, along comes Kenneth White in this whole other paradigm that I had trouble figuring out, and I still have a little trouble figuring out what it all means. I mean, I've read and read and read, and I still kind of can't completely figure out, like I've joked with Nori before, this opening a world thing. I have no idea what that means. I've been reading about it now for 5 years, and I still can't quite get it. It's somebody said, I think it was Michael McKim said somewhere in one of his essays or blogs that there's a lot about White and eco and geopoetics that's almost shamanistic and mystical. That is still that once again that area where we can't quite pin it down through language. And then I don't know what the third part of that Venn diagram is. Maybe the rest of the world, and how the rest of the world really doesn't care a lot about this stuff. It's not something. There aren't a lot of people sitting within a mile of me right now thinking about geopoetry. And there are 50,000 people within a mile of me, and every one of us has our little circle. And yet it's very important to me. It's very important to figure out where the crossover is and the overlap and all that. And so I think that's one of the areas that we'll go toward and we'll move toward with Geopoetics Appalachia, is trying to figure out where those crossing points are.
Yeah.
I think that, Mark, I still appreciate your acknowledging that we as artists are often wondering what we're doing. Where does it come from? Why am I driven to sit in a cabin 9 by 6 feet every summer and just write about the land in Canada? Why, where is this coming from? Since we talk about shamanism, since we talk about Taoism, and we speak of Buddhism, I think that we have been hesitant to fully step into that. I think that in a mechanized scientific society, we're afraid of stepping into the woo-woo. We're afraid of stepping into the feminine. We're afraid of stepping into our emotions. And I think we just need to quit that behavior. I think that what we are doing when we're infusing science with meaning is we are drawing the feminine into the masculine. We are calling it in, and we are being passionate. We are being emotional. We are tuning into a vibration that is forming the universe. And we don't have to equivocate or apologize for knowing what we know from our experience in making art. We make it, we experience it, it is real. And we can read Paul Ekman, the scientific expert on emotion, his wonderful conversations with the Dalai Lama, where they just agree. And there are so many examples now where physicists sit with the Dalai Lama for 3 days and just agree. They just agree. So we don't have to apologize. The universe is made of creative energy. And we, the artists, can feel the creative energy come through us. And we recognize that there are systems that have been very helpful for the last 300 years, developing scientific knowledge, and it is time to infuse them with creative energy. And once we know that, once we can act from that place, we can look at a sickness in society, we can look at a sickness in a scientific institution. And this has been happening here in Asheville. We have the National Oceanic, what is it called, John? The NOAA, N-O-A-A, atmospheric something. And it's where all the, we're in the hotspot of climatic data, and it's not kept in Washington, D.C. because it's protected here in Asheville. And they invite writers to come up and teach them how to talk. And so it's not just us banging on the doors of the institutions. The institutions have reached what Pseudo-Dionysius in the Apocrypha calls the divine gloom. They've reached the end of their brains, and they need the next place to spread into. And that's what we're offering. And that's why the doors are opening to us. I get surgeons saying, I'm a poet. And I don't have anyone to talk to. And the world is now saying yes to shamanism, Buddhism, Taoism. And Mircea Eliade, shamanism has the information in there on how to do it. There are systems. I just finished reading The Path of the Sacred Warrior. There are systems for doing it. It is not a mystery. It isn't even mysticism anymore. It's science. How about that? Good morning.
Oh, I'm so in agreement with you. Absolutely. And I think what's wonderful is that, you know, this is kind of emerging through us all right now. It's almost as if we don't have to force it. It is just, you know, the fact that our membership here is growing and growing, and so many people, including myself, I knew nothing about geopoetics, but I realized that that's what I was doing anyway. And I think, you know, and there was another comment in the question in the chat about how, you know, everyone is engaging with nature, and particularly just now, it's people are walking more, they're doing their gardens, you know. It's just, I think it's like, it's almost as though it is just something that it's where we are, and it's emerging, and it's very exciting. So where are we with everything? I think we're over time, but we've got until past. Are there any more questions?
Mark's got one.
Mark, yeah. Anybody else who hasn't asked a question? Just first of all, anybody else?
Can I just, could I ask something about just kind of basically what advice would you give people who are kind of starting out on their creative writing journey, and, you know, just that sort of initial kind of getting started? What would you say to them?
Lovely, great question.
Ooh.
John, would you like to lead?
Well, I mean, I can just speak to the things that have always worked and continue to work for me. I mean, I love a quote from a wonderful American poet from the West Coast named William Stafford, who wrote a poem a day for over 50 years. And his advice was always, there's no such thing as writer's block as long as you set your standards low enough. Mm-hmm. And I believe that, because he would write 365 poems a day, and I mean a year, and there'd maybe be 5 or 6 that would end up in a literary journal. But he did not judge any of those other 360 that did not end up in the journal. He just wrote every day. So I would say write as much as you can and don't judge it. Would be my advice, and you'll get better, I think.
And my advice is use it for everything. Use it whenever life overwhelms you. Use it whenever your heart breaks. Use it whenever unrest surrounds you. Turn to poetry. Turn to your essay writing, your story writing, and let it heal you. and discover that bond, that sacred bond between creativity and healing, and you will withstand anything. And then you will emerge into the role of the leader and the teacher.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, thank you both. I actually feel quite moved. Thank you. That was lovely.
That's beautiful. John,
And
were you going to
welcome.
say something else?
Well, I was going to add that the way to get into that poem every day is a mutual friend of ours, I think Laura knows her, is Kathy Smith Bowers, a poet, a beautiful poet of the mountains. And she talks often about finding the golden thread is another thing that she got from William Stafford. And that means every morning when you get up, from the time you get up, you start looking for that single thing that might lead to a poem. Like yesterday for me, a dolphin surfaced next to my kayak on a kayak float. And that was it. That was that golden thread that if I could use that image to get into a poem, I was there. And the day before, it was something as simple as sitting on the balcony and realizing there was a view of the ocean from the second floor, but that houses were starting to push in on it. And so that became the golden thread for me to write a poem from. So every day, just think, all I've got to find this single 24-hour day is one little thread and I can get a poem.
Wow, that's so beautiful. What brilliant answers. I really love Mary Oliver, the poet, particularly her wild geese.
Yes.
Okay, so Mark, you wanted to say something or ask something?
Yeah, it was just a comment that Laura reminded me of, just that came out when you talked about writing in a log cabin, being locked away there. I was reminded, it goes back to the 60s, you know, we're talking about Zen and Buddhism and the kind of, those kind of roots. Nori will maybe connect with this, but Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who kind of rejected and became a bête noire of the new move of radicalism in the 1960s, he actually put himself away for 7 days and wrote a series of poems, Aus dem Sieben Tagen, as a rejection, along with Cage in many ways, of the way in which serialism and very closely defined music, cerebral music, was going. He was derided for it for many years, and he was really quite an odd character. But one of his poems, it struck with me, he talks about playing a note in the rhythm of the universe, Laura, which you also mentioned. And it's really interesting that here we are 60 years later, accepting that these are tenets which we should actually address and maybe nurture. In rejection, as Kenneth would say, the nihilism, you know, that no, maybe, okay, how do we do it? That kind of sense of looking at things again and not being driven by the way in which others have forced us into it, as it were, over decades and centuries. Just a comment, maybe John or Laura have a thought on that.
It's very beautiful, and we have been we've been marginalized as artists and creatives through 300 years of science. And the science is great, the science is wonderful. But after Isaac Newton, poetry took a big hit. And then we discovered that Newton was writing poetry all along, and he hid it all in these trunks that opened in 1969. And he was into all the woo-woo stuff too, but that woo-woo emotional, wonderful stuff got muted. I just finished reading The Sacred Warrior and a bunch of other, deep in the Buddhist texts right now, and seeing that, oh, that was poetry. That was poetry all along. It was my meditation. It was my fire. It was my emptiness. It was everything that the wise ones have been teaching us to do. And to make that bridge has just been remarkably healing. To see that creative energy is wind horse, energy is chi, is kingdom of heaven, whatever we want to call it. But wow, the world needs this energy. And if we can teach it to others and help others feel unashamed to seal themselves in a little cabin for 9 days and write. And I do have a little cabin in Canada in the North Woods, and John has read the book of poems that got written there. And it was very interesting. I wrote for 10 days, and they were all these poems that I didn't understand what I was doing with them. And then I realized it was the 100th anniversary of the death of Tom Thomson, the great Canadian painter. And he died just about 100 kilometers from where I was writing. And I thought, okay, I just was listening to Tom Thomson. And that was how the poems were written. They were written in these brush strokes. And you would tune into that, and you don't say that was crazy. You don't say that was schizophrenia. You don't say that's foolish. You say, wow, the universe is more complex and beautiful, and we need to open the channels for communicating this.
I love it.
Thanks, Mark.
It reminds me of the idea of being, being just vessels for this creative force, and allowing the creative force to kind of come through us as vessels rather than kind of being so judgmental. And the other thing about the Buddhism and everything, and remembering too that this is like an amazing particular time that we're at now, where the majority of us have access to all these ancient teachings, all the ancient wisdom that for so long has been hidden. It's been only for the elite, it's been secret, and now all of this is kind of bubbled up for the majority of us now, and it's an incredible time. We can direct our own self-learning. We can follow what we're interested in rather than having to sit and be told what we're supposed to be learning. So it's very exciting in so many ways.
I think that's a crucial point you made there, that I think White also makes, that today we have access to all the cultures of history, as far as they are available to us online and so on, and more museums and others are putting things online so that you can access them without going, long distances. But I think this is a good moment to wind things up, Laura, Tina, when we've hit on the real issue here, which is how do we be creative? And I think we've had wonderful answers to that tonight. So I think it's a very, very strong boost for Geopoetics Appalachia tonight. I'm amazed by the conversation we've had, and so many people coming in on the chat. It's been great. So that's my thought.
It's been a wonderful chat. I really loved it, really enjoyed it. It's been really interesting. Lots of great questions. I hope everybody's managed to got their question asked. Is that Laura? No, sorry, sound. So just a huge thank you to John and to Laura. It's just been a really fascinating, interesting discussion. Thank you to everybody who's been here, who's come here, who's been involved here and asked the questions. It's been a lovely conversation. And then we have our next conversation, and I can't remember the date, but it's in the chat, and just look out. You'll be reminded anyway. So do we have anything else to say, Nori or Laura or John? Anybody who'd like to add anything?
I'd just like to say thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a million to everyone for turning up, and I hope you've got a lot out of it. I certainly have. I just loved that the answer to Yvonne's question that both John and Laura gave, and I'm going to start applying it as from tomorrow.
That's brilliant. Okay, so we'll say we're officially closed, and thank you all, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
See you.
Bye-bye.
and there will be a chance at the end to ask